Sup nerds? Today I'm talking about the Ditting Lab Suite, and the reason why I'm talking about this now is that it is currently my benchmark grinder in both filter and in espresso. And I want to see if my opinion changes for the rest of 2021 all the way into 2022 because I'm getting a ton of other grinders and I want to see if my favorite changes. So I don't have the Lab Suite here with me anymore. Behind me I have a boring Niche Zero. The Lab Suite was on loan from angel investor of the YouTube channel Brandon. Thank you so much for lending that grinder for me for a fairly long time. I now want to talk about Ditting grinders, kind of my familiarity with them or lack of familiarity with them, and how that kind of leads to a purchase decision. Then I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about flavors and comparisons of the Lab Suite, mainly the Lab Suite 80mm Caspers, to a ton of other burr sets that I've tried. And I also want to talk about, which I think is more important than the flavors, is owning one of them, using one of them. What is it like to have a Lab Suite as your main grinder? Where I see Ditting grinders is actually at Phil's Coffee, which is a Bay Area or West Coast chain, more basic. They have a mint mojito. I will defend that thing to death. But that's where I see those Ditting grinders. I don't see them in fancy specialty third wave coffee shops. I see more Malcone grinders, compacts, those types of grinders. In these enthusiast communities, when people are talking about high-end grinders, I'm not talking about Niche Zeros and DF64s. I'm talking about endgame expensive grinders. You don't really see people talk about Lab Suite all that often. When people say, hey, what grinder should I buy? People are like, oh, you should buy an Ultra, you should buy a P100, you should buy P64, you should buy all of these. So I did want to elaborate on this a little bit more in the enthusiast community, and I want you to think about enthusiasts you know. At least for me, I know so many people with monoliths, ultras, P100s, and all of that. If I wanted to get one of those grinders in and try one of them or go to a friend's house, I can do that. I only know one guy with the Lab Suite, mainly because maybe it's way more hype to buy one of those grinders. There's a pre-order system. It's crazy to get one of these endgame grinders. And that might be why enthusiasts online don't really recommend the Lab Suite so much, because it's so hard to actually try one. Adding on to that too, it's a commercial grinder. So it's like, how many guys are going out there and saying, I want to buy a commercial grinder, I want to stick it in my house and I want to use it? Not that many people, especially when all these more attractive home high-end endgame grinders exist. When you look at the pricing of a Lab Suite, it is still up there. Although I will say the used market for Lab Suites is really strong. In fact, you can get a Lab Suite for sub 2,000, and I think that's something you should really consider. But now let me talk about flavors, comparisons of burr sets, all of that. On the screen here are all the burrs that I've tried, and I'll be comparing the Lab Suite to a few of these. But first I want to start off by talking about the Niche Zero and the 64mm SSP multi-purpose brew burrs. There's one main property of the 64mm SSP multi-purpose burrs that I absolutely love. They're clarity monsters. They will present to you what the notes on the bag say. For example, if it's supposed to taste like oranges, you will most likely be able to taste oranges. For me, the main reason why I like SSP multi-purpose burrs with 64mm is that I, for one, do really like clarity, but it's really how the acidity is presented to you, or the clarity or those notes are presented to you whenever you take a sip of the espresso or filter. For me, this is what the SSP multi-purpose are doing. When you take a sip, the acidity is presented sharp in the center of your tongue. It then kind of fizzles out. It's kind of very like sparkly, fizzly, very sharp, crisp acidity presentation. I love that. I really do. Because if I'm drinking a coffee that has acidic notes or things that I really prefer, for example, oranges, it's like a sharp, sharp hit of clarity. It's like maybe a super peak, and you're just like, oh, it tastes like what it says on the bag. And it tastes amazing. You just get so much information there, so much clarity. It can be overwhelming for some folks, and that's why people don't like them so much, and they opt for something like the high uniformity. For me, what is missing and lacking in these burrs are the body, or really the aftertaste, is that you get that sharp hit of clarity, and then sometimes it's like, whoa, okay, that's it. It goes away, and then you're kind of just left with sometimes dryness, and really, it's not really that dry, but it's like not as smooth of a transition as I would have liked. That's a personal preference. That's kind of the conclusion of 64mm SSP multi-purpose burrs for me, is that in espresso, super high clarity espresso, very, very sharp presentation and filter, but sometimes the aftertaste is just not as smooth or presentable to me. And in espresso, I felt like the 64mm SSP multi-purpose burrs just don't provide the thick body that I actually really like in the Niche Zero. Now let's talk about the Niche Zero. What do I like about Niche Zero and what do I not like about Niche Zero? So the Niche Zero, to me, and maybe controversial opinion here, I think the Niche Zero makes very boring coffee. It's good, but it tastes all like chocolate. I wish there was something more. I wish there was something more interesting, something else going on, but it's just a good cup. You always get a good cup, but it's like, Filter, I'm not even gonna talk about filter. We all know Niche Zero filter is not the best. But in espresso, this is what's so good about the Niche Zero. High body espresso, that thick body that you would want in a large conical burr set, that is what is missing in the SSP multi-purpose burrs. I also really like how the acidity in the Niche Zero, or at least the body, is so smooth. It's like you drink that espresso, it's smooth. And that's something that I feel like is a little bit lacking on the espresso side with the SSP multi-purpose burrs. Now, why did I tell you about the Niche? Why did I tell you about the SSP multi-purpose? That's pretty obvious, because to me, the Lab Suite combines the best properties of both of those burr sets into one. Let me say that again. It takes the best properties, SSP multi-purpose, high clarity, and in the Niche Zero, high body, slams them together into one burr set. And to me, it's like the Swiss Army knife. It works in both filter and espresso. High body, high clarity in filter, high body, high clarity in espresso. And let me elaborate a little now. The reason why I find the Lab Suite so preferable to me is that when you take a sip of a filter cup, for example, of the Lab Suite, the way the acidity, it's super clear. It's even, I would say, more clear than the SSP multipurposers. But it's that aftertaste. It's how the acidity transitions out. Is that it coats your tongue and then it goes out smooth like a conical burr, like that Niche Zero, smooth. So high clarity, then smooth, instead of high clarity, peak, or really no clarity in the Niche Zero and mainly just high body. And it just does this in everything you drink. And I love that. It's like, whoa, I can drink anything. It's gonna have high body, it's gonna have high clarity. And those are two properties that I absolutely love about the Lab Suite. You can brew under so many different conditions. You can push really fine grinds without any sort of astringency. And it's just like, it works. I can extract more, I can use my light roast, and it won't over extract and it won't taste bad. And that's really awesome. Practically speaking, the grounds coming out of Lab Suite are just stupidly uniform. It's really difficult to make bad coffee with the Lab Suite. Also to mention, when it comes to sweetness, oh yeah, these burrs are sweet. For those of you who have tried 64mm SSP multipurpose burrs, you're getting that really nice clarity, and sometimes you're getting mild sweetness, I would argue. Think about all of those properties, but just kind of turned up more. That's what the Lab Suite is, but it's not overpowering. It's way more, but it's not overpowering where it feels like it is dry or it's gone. It then transitions smoothly into what you would prefer in something like the Niche Zero or a big conical. And that's so cool. I'm like, yes, give me more of this. That's for me what I love about the Lab Suite. It tastes so good. It's sweet, high clarity, high body. You can't go wrong with that flavor profile, in my opinion, for a lot of people. The other 80mm burr set that I've tried was the 80mm SSP Ultra Low Fines burr. I just had it in another Ditting. I tried it side by side, and it was super similar. To me, the way that the 80mm SSP burr presented acidity was very similar to the Lab Suite burrs. So instead of the acidity being, if I were to try to use my hands and show you, the difference is that the Lab Suite burrs were much more peaky in terms of clarity. So the thing is, you would get that hit of clarity, then it would really spread around your tongue and it'd be nice and smooth transition. Similar, very similar properties in the Ultra Low Fines version, but just not as peaky, not as high clarity in my opinion, or not as acidic. And I think that's a very preferable property. It's actually very similar to something like SSP multipurpose versus SSP high uniformity in the 64mm burr set, or really I would say it's more niche-like. Now, I did make a video talking about what is it like to have a commercial grinder at home, what are the pros and cons, but let me talk specifically about the Lab Suite. The Lab Suite is really pushing against your pain threshold as an enthusiast. It's big, it's messy, it's loud, but I think you have to consider the quality of coffee here. So there's a balance. It's like, how much are you willing to sacrifice to get that amazing coffee, but also maybe a potentially very loud and messy experience. It's not as bad as an EK. I know if you've used an EK, you know that you yeet those beans in there, it goes crazy. There's a ton of static, a ton of fines, a ton of just crazy stuff happens with an EK. The Lab Suite is still like that. So you can RDT, you can do all this stuff, but there's still going to be high exchange, still losing about like 1.3-ish grams, like kind of in that range. It's not too bad, to be honest, because Lab Suite, like I'm willing to take that trade because the burrs are so good. There's the grinds knocker, and what would happen is if you didn't RDT, even if you did RDT, a lot of fines and just like that chaff and all that stuff would just get stuck to that chute there. So then you would sometimes be brewing with all these random fines if you actually decide to use the knocker. The Lab Suite is just kind of a box, and you have to keep in mind that this is a grinder that is 50 to 60 pounds. It's a pretty heavy grinder. Moving this from point A to point B is a little bit painful. It's not something like an EK43 or EK43S where you can kind of just hug the grinder. You can't do that with the Lab Suite. You actually have to, like, it's slippery. It's like, what the heck, how do I carry this grinder? Sometimes you just leave the grinder there and then you just bump it and grinds just fly out. You gotta be careful, and there is a tray, but make sure you have like brushes and everything that keep that space clean. While the Lab Suite looks very small in photos, it's probably one of the smallest commercial grinders you can purchase out there that's any good. It is still super tall. So here's this brief photo of the Lab Suite next to a bunch of other grinders, and with that hopper, it's tall. So I use the Lab Suite as a multi-burst grinder for a few months. I used it for filter and I used it for espresso. So switching between filter and espresso. There are some slight nuances with how the Lab Suite works. So basically there's a dial on the side, and that gives you the whole entire range. So you can go from super coarse cold brew brewing all the way to espresso fine. All you have to do actually to calibrate is you just unscrew that, and then you have a little dial on the inside that you can adjust. It is a stepless adjustment, but you're gonna need to really figure out, like, do you drink more espresso? Do you drink filter? Because we wanna get really, really intricate dialing in. You're gonna lose range depending on how fine and coarse you make the burrs go. So for example, the way I had that Lab Suite set up was more for filter. So for an espresso dialing in, the range that I had was probably between 1 and 1.5. And it's a stepless adjustment. So adjusting that was like really trying to make my adjustments like this, like going on the dial, and it was a pain sometimes, but I think that's just kind of the nature of a lot of these commercial grinders, especially if they're commercial grinders that can be used for a variety of brewings. Like, you just gotta kind of deal with that stuff in dialing in. It's like, yeah, it's not the most friendly thing. Now let me also talk about using the grinder. So it's pretty awesome. You lift the hopper up, you throw your beans in, the inside's all like metal in the hopper, and you hear this super satisfying like clinging noise, like boom. Yes, you know you put the beans in there, sounds super satisfying. And when you run the grinder, it just shreds those beans up. So pick your poison here in terms of grinding noise. It is a fairly loud grinder, but it's only loud for 2 seconds. Like, not that long compared to something like the niche. So it's like, would you rather have a medium noise for a really long time, or would you have high noise for a really low time? That's kind of things you should consider. I did actually just most of the time grind directly into the portafilter, but I did have to make sure that my portafilter had a dosing funnel, otherwise things would just fly everywhere. It's, at the end of the day, a commercial grinder, and it makes amazing coffee. Now that you've heard me talk about the wonderful flavors of the Lab Suite and obviously living with one of these things, let me offer some alternatives to the Lab Suite. The first alternative I want to talk about is just buy the burrs. Take those burrs and stick them in something like the EG1, a much more livable grinder in my opinion. I think the EG1 can be a cleaner grinder than the Lab Suite to use, but depends on how your workflow and your RDTing and RPMs you're running the EG1 at. The second grinder you should totally consider is the Levercraft Ultra. That grinder has an 80mm carrier that you could stick the Lab Suite burrs in. And that is a grinder that is much quieter. It's stupidly quiet compared to the Lab Suite. Oh, and then for memes, you can buy a bun G1, G2, G3, G4, make a bunnzilla, stick these 80mm burrs in as well. But that might be, I mean, maybe I'll do that. I don't know if I can, but yeah, that's like a meme pick. Now, because the lab sweet burrs are so good, in my opinion, I've only found one grinder that is the closest to the lab sweet burrs, and that is the Kafatek Monolith MC4. The MC4 just does everything the lab sweet does just as well, with the exception of filter coffee. In espresso, high body, high clarity, amazing acidity presentation, coats your tongue, super smooth transition. I love, love, love it. Gave me a lot of purchase validation when I benchmarked it with Brandon against Lab Suite. I had the MC4 next to Lab Suite. What is different between the MC4 and Lab Suite is filter brewing. I much preferred the filter cups out of the Lab Suite compared to the MC4. Though the properties were the same, the MC4 just felt a bit harsher. Very enjoyable cup from the MC4, but maybe because it's conical, it just felt a little less smooth. It felt a little bit harsher, at least in terms of that aftertaste compared to Lab Suite. But it is the closest that I have found to, in terms of not being the Lab Suite burrs, to tasting like the Lab Suite burrs. Okay, now let's be real here. Spending $2,000 on a grinder is not viable. As much as I love the MC4, it just is not a viable grinder for a lot of people to buy. And I really hate to say this, but I haven't found another burr set that just does what the Lab Suite does. It's like, those burrs are magical. So if you do want a cheaper alternative to the Lab Suite, maybe consider actually building a bunnzilla. Don't actually do that. That's a terrible idea. But there are two burr sets that are coming out. One is the Option O 64mm burrs. Those look like basically baby Ditting Lab Suite burrs. I'm 100% gonna pick those up. I'm very excited for those. And the Ode V2 burrs. I'm not saying this because I work for Fellow, but I think that's something worth considering. And you'll see me talk about those burrs in the future. Both of those burrs. I'm totally picking up those Option O burrs. Now, this is what I will recommend for people who do not want to spend too much money. Depending on where you are in your coffee journey, you probably shouldn't be considering a Lab Suite anyway, unless you already have other grinders, like other good grinders. I probably would not jump from something like a niche or a 64mm SSP multipurpose to a Lab Suite. I'd probably get something else, then you get the Lab Suite, because it's like, you just don't know yet. I would consider doing this, is splitting up the money or your budget that you had. If you're gonna buy a Lab Suite, I personally think you should just buy two grinders. So you should buy a grinder that provides you high clarity, and you should buy a grinder that provides you high body. For me, that's a grinder that can fit 64mm burrs in it and something like the Niche Zero or a big conical. So that way you can kind of be like, this is what I like in high body, this is what I like in high clarity, and you can really determine your next purchase. I hate that that's a stopgap, but I personally feel like a grinder that already fits 64mm burrs is already getting you like 90% of the way to what a Lab Suite and many of these end grinders are doing, and kind of what just gives you the experience of, oh, this is what high body is a big conical burr set. And in the 64mm world, maybe a burr set that you should consider is actually the 64mm high uniformity burrs, which kind of are a tick more closer to high clarity like the SSP multipurpose burrs, but veer more towards what a big conical tastes like. That's it. That's my take on the Ditting Lab Suite. I love that grinder. I love the burrs, and they're absolutely magical. What people all say online is true with this grinder. The burrs are so good, but it's a commercial grinder, and I just am not sure if that's something that you should do. I did it for a while, and it was not the greatest experience. I'm maybe being a little bit light here, but yeah, I just didn't really like it too much about. It's like, yeah, this thing's huge, it's loud, it's messy, and that's really why I went and got a Kafatek MC4. Is the MC4 has most of the properties that the Lab Suite does, but it's much cleaner, it's much quieter, and it's just much easier to work with. But if you can find a Lab Suite for a really cheap price, or you can find those burrs, you should seriously consider picking it up. I would just suggest you try those burrs out because they're absolutely magical. But that's it. That's my take on the Lab Suite. Thank you for spending the time to watch the video. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon.